Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my wrap-up for March Mystery Madness. I did do a TBR for March Mystery Madness, but none of the things that I actually read were on that TBR. There are a couple that I am probably picking up in the next couple of days, but that will go in a later video. I ended up thinking that I would experiment a little more and see what I could find at the library, and I read some things that are not the kind of thing I would normally have picked up, and so I did have a couple of DNFs and a couple of disappointments, but I think that's fair because it's fun to sometimes try things that you wouldn't have picked up otherwise. So back in the discussion video that I made a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that I mentioned picking up was some of the BBC radio audio plays of some of Agatha Christie's work, most of which were Miss Marple stories, although a couple of them were standalone pieces or ones with one of her other sleuths. And one of the things that I think I didn't mention in that discussion was that a lot of these are not quite abridged versions of the original stories that are just acted out. It's that they are modernizations, sometimes with dramatically different character or plot changes. For example, the version of Swan Song changes some of the major relationships in the plot, and also changes some of the characters' names, some of which is just because of, I suppose, culture shifts, but sometimes it seems to be an artistic choice. So that's kind of interesting in and of itself, and I think turns them into something that's more akin to like a Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, the book, not the movie. Although, I mean, I suppose you can make an argument that it's almost like the movie and that you have sound effects. But just in the fact that it's taking something, an original work, and playing with it and turning it into something new while still using a lot of the original material. So it's not exactly the multitude of Pride and Prejudice retellings that exist in, say, romance novels, for example, but it is closer to a Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, where they've taken the original material and added things, but are still using a lot of the original book. So that is what a lot of these are closer to. In addition to Swan Song, which is a story about an opera singer, and some of that makes sense to have changed because we are now in a post-Soviet era, and also the original gave the character a name that ended in ov instead of ova, which is not realistic to begin with. And so some of those changes make sense. Others, didn't really need to be made. The 199-pound adventure becomes slightly funnier just because it keeps the amount of money that the main character is going to spend to have an adventure. And obviously, inflation means that that's a lot cheaper than it was when Agatha Christie originally wrote the original story. So that's all kind of interesting stuff. I will say that the best of the ones that I listened to was probably Miss Marple's Last Cases, which is a collection of the 3 short stories that are generally collected in the published book of Miss Marple's Last Cases. And while that has some elements of updating to it, those ones are the most true to the original work. And Miss Marple in those is played by June Whitfield, who also played her in the TV series, which was interesting. Speaking of TV series, I also listened to one proper audiobook, and that was The Yellow Iris, which is also in Agatha Christie. It's one of the Poirot stories, and it's narrated by Hugh Fraser, who played Hastings in the TV series. And so when he's doing Poirot's voice, he's doing an imitation of David Suchet as Poirot. So that's a lot of fun. And I would say that that was one of my favorites, not necessarily because it was a proper audiobook and not a radio play, but just because I think I like Poirot better than I like Miss Marple as a character. I know some people feel the opposite about that one, but I think that's the conclusion that I'm coming to. I also DNF'd a couple of books, but in both cases that was because my expectations were in the wrong place for both of them. So it's not necessarily that I have a complaint about the material itself, it's just that I had been hoping for something else. So the first of those was Sadda Masi's The Flower Master. So Sadda Masi is the author of the Praveen Mystery series, which are set in 1920s India. This is from her earlier series, which is the Rei Shimura series, which are about a woman from California who goes to become an antique dealer in Japan, and her father is Japanese, so she's also meeting up with her relatives. And in this one, the mystery begins when one of her aunts tells her she doesn't understand floral arranging properly and sends her to a class, and mystery ensues. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, except that the Praveen Mystery series does a thing that I like in that it mixes history and a very traditional kind of sleuthing, which is what I like in mysteries generally. This, on the other hand, is kind of mixing some of the tropes of cozy mysteries and some of the stylistic choices from thrillers. And I will read the occasional cozy, but it's not really my thing. And I also am not a big fan of thrillers because I feel like, for whatever reason, there's a lot of personal drama is the wrong word, but a lot of irritating personalities seems to be always be part of that. And so I don't like this particular combination. And it's a one that's set in the current day. It's not a historical piece. So it just wasn't doing what I go to this author for. So I was glad to have tried it because that's always interesting to see what an author does on a different series, especially when it has such a dramatically different setting in terms of space and time. But I think this series is just not for me. If you are interested in a story that involves an antiques dealer in Japan in the current day, I think you will enjoy this a lot. I think if you want to see something that mixes tropes of thrillers and cozies, this will be right up your alley, because I think that is something that I think there are other people who go to those two subgenres far more than I do. And this will be something you enjoy, but it just wasn't something that I enjoyed. Or on the topic of DNFs, I also put aside When No One Is Watching, which is a thriller by romance writer Alyssa Cole. There was nothing necessarily wrong with it, although the pacing wasn't really my thing. I was listening to the audio version. I just didn't really want to read a thriller about gentrification. I've been dramatically priced out of the neighborhood that I was previously house hunting in, and my sense of humor just was not in the place to read a thriller about gentrification. So I might come back to this one later, but if you saw me talking about this on Instagram, that's why it's not here. One book that I read that I finished because it was a comic, so it was short, was so bad that it was almost mind-blowing. And this was Jessica Blandy Volume 1, Remember Enola Gay, which is a Dufaux and Renaud book, who were a Belgian comic writer and artist who were very active in the 1980s. And this book was originally published in the late 80s. But Europe Comics just produced a localization of it 2 years ago. And it's one of these books where you think, how on earth did you think this was the thing that you wanted to translate? Because one, it's wildly dated in so many really offensive ways. It's also completely bizarre. It also has extremely European and extremely Franco-Belgian sensibilities to it, but it's set in California. So there's a serial killer who's murdering people. And everybody's naked, mostly the women, but the men are 90% naked. Here's a 1980s Eurotrash kind of sensibility put on top of California. And it's so bizarre. It's such a strange book. And it's the kind of book where you go, I understand why this was published for a European Francophone audience in the 1980s. Like, it makes sense in that context. It's ridiculous. But I get it. Why Europe Comics thought this should go into the English market in the 21st century makes no sense to me, because I think anybody who's interested in this as a cultural piece will be able to read the French version. So, and anyone who's not interested in this as a cultural piece, I can't imagine wanting to read this because it's really bad. So, and it's so weird. I think it's brilliant what Europe Comics is doing, because they translate so many works from so many different countries into English so that the Anglo-American market can see what is happening in all these different genres. And that's amazing, but this is such a weird thing. Unbelievable. So I would not recommend this to anyone unless you are interested in comparing cultural spaces and seeing just how yeah, I don't know. I neglected to write down the translator's name, but I'll include it in the notes. But it's not the translator's fault that this is so bad. Whoever decided that this needed to be translated, they are to blame, because this is so bad. Oh my goodness. Yeah, not good at all. Did I read anything that I liked? And I did, actually. The one thing that I liked was Brian McClellan's Blood Tally. This is in his Valkyrie Collection series, which is an urban fantasy mystery series in which each volume is this kind of repo man / private investigator in an urban fantasy setting in which characters from various mythologies are living in the current day. The main character, who has Norwegian troll heritage, and his sidekick is a djinn who's trapped inside a ring, and an Egyptian sphinx who is mostly his house cat, but occasionally is not just a house cat. and always wants fancier tuning. The series is silly, but it knows that it's silly, and I appreciate that. I enjoy McClellan's fantasy series. McClellan is better known for writing flintlock fantasy, which is kind of like traditional epic fantasy, except set in like a pseudo 19th century setting. He writes some humor in those, but this is clearly meant to be a funny story and a mystery, and in this, the main character and his sidekicks are investigating a runaway vampire thrall, which leads to discovering a vampire multi-level marketing scheme. And yeah, it's nonsense, but it's fun nonsense. So I wouldn't recommend this to anybody who wants a serious mystery, or for anybody who wants their urban fantasy to not be too pop culture-y, because he does do a lot of things, especially with bands. He'll mention real bands, and it's like, look, in this world with the troll and the djinn and the sphinx and the vampires, they still have the, and that's always a little silly. But again, I think if you go into this with the right attitude and you want something that's silly and violent, this is, despite being silly, it's definitely not a cozy. There's actually, I mean, it's not that extreme, but yeah, I think if you would like to read a silly urban fantasy mystery, this is a fun one. There we go. That was one that I liked. If you were taking part in March Mystery Madness, I'd love to hear what you read. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you think of them, especially if you read that Jessica Blandy book or any of the other books in that series, because that was such nonsense. Yeah, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. Yeah, the other thing that's been fun is I've been running the March Mystery Madness Instagram page, and it's been fun talking to everybody on there every day, so that's been grand. If you weren't following that one, please check it out, because I think if we do Subgenre September again, or definitely for March Mystery Madness next year, we'll be back with that one, because that was a lot of fun. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.